I was slightly worried that my talk might be a bit of an outlier, but I just sat through the afternoon. I wasn't here in the morning. I'm sorry about that. I was teaching, and I see all sorts of connections actually with what I wanted to talk about. So there's a theme about sort of stories about where things come from, food and what you consume comes from, which is very, very much at the heart of, I think, people's consumption behaviour around fair trade. There's an idea of satisfaction, of worth, of connection with communities. Not, in my case, through and with communities, but not through work, but through consumption. And there's also this interesting link with the IUF, actually. In the IUF, I have a friend who works for the IUF who tells me she's constantly astonished by the aggression of fair trade compared to these multinational food corporations. So it's very interesting, and I've been on the end of some of that, as you'll no doubt work out why in a second. So what I want to say is, I think that one way to look at fair trade is this, that it's trying to help us make informed decisions and try and do the right thing through the way we consume. And that's really, really hard. Lots of people want to make a difference, do the right thing through their consumption choices, but they don't know enough. I don't know enough, and I'm one of the very few people who's had the privilege of being able to do 4 years research in Uganda and Ethiopia on this kind of thing, one small part of the whole chain and so on and so forth. So what do we do in a climate, a context of huge uncertainty and lack of knowledge? We take shortcuts. And one of the ways in which I think that we're helped to take those shortcuts is through very, very powerful narratives that help us make those decisions. And fair trade has been an enormously effective branding agency, a narrative developer. And I want to talk at first a little bit about the kind of information that comes through to people about fair trade and how that's changing. And it's partly, I think, that there's the advocacy work and on the website, so on and so forth. It's partly also, until quite recently, most of what we thought we knew about whether or not fair trade worked, how it worked, for whom it worked, came from very limited research that was largely commissioned by fair trade and handed out to very, very sympathetic researchers. And I think there are huge problems with a lot of the methodology. It's very, very quick and dirty, in and out, so on and so forth. And so you get this wonderful idea about how effective it is. You know, it's labouring in production of fair trade is really good fun. And, you know, this is actually not a flower farm. I mean, it's wonderful, it's very happy. I'm great, I'll pay the extra for that. Fair enough, perhaps. Combined with this, I think, kind of often quite bad research and very limited. To give them their dues, they have a very small budget for research. There is what I think increasingly is becoming obvious to many people is a very, very widespread problem with auditing and audit culture. We call it the Tesco problem in the light of recent experiences with auditors just too close to the people they're supposed to be auditing. And it's a monopoly position that what's it called, Flow Cert, the certifying body, the auditing body for Fair Trade International, has. And typically, again, it's under-resourced. So what happens is they pre-announce their visits. They go and they say, we're coming to your farm there. And they just have a little checklist. Tick, tick, tick. They don't really probe or look. They don't have the resources to do it. They don't have any competition prodding them to, so on and so forth. So we build up through these things this very, very effective story that we've had for a long time. However, I think that of late there has begun to be much more careful, independent, and methodologically more interesting research work that's actually generating quite a lot of critical reflection. I mean, it raises very, very big questions for fair trade, including Stefan's done some stuff on this as well. Our own research, this is the Harvard-based research, there's a guy, Valkila and Nygren in Finland, I think, and ours is called this, FTEPR. You can hit us on our website and find our final report. That stands for Fair Trade, Employment and Poverty Research in Ethiopia and Uganda. It was a 4-year project. It was funded by DFID. I think they may have regretted it, but that's fine by me. And what we wanted to focus on was these people, was the wage work, which has really been almost invisible in the fair trade. Fair trade itself hasn't, it's only very recently that they've begun to sort of acknowledge the significance of wage employment and the production of things that are certified as fair trade, particularly those produced by so-called smallholder producer organizations. They have different standards. One is hired labor organization standards, that's for the flowers, bananas in Colombia, so on and so forth. The other is these SPOs, smallholder producer organizations. So coffee cooperatives, tea cooperatives in Uganda, Ethiopia, so on and so forth. The assumption being that smallholder farming is an egalitarian thing, where everybody has roughly the same amount of land, and they use family labour. And this is a myth that's perpetuated by the people who manage many of those cooperatives and cooperative unions and so on. And it takes about 10 minutes of field work to just blow that out of the air. So we did this research. I won't bore you with the methods, but we did a big survey. We did a repeat survey to get something slightly longitudinal. We did life histories of over 100 people, etc., etc. And what did we find? Let me concentrate on some of the main findings. One is the wage labour is actually much more widespread and important in these rural areas, Ethiopia and Uganda, than is ever really realised. Certainly by fair trade, and actually much more broadly than that. And the people who depend for their survival on wage employment opportunities are the very poorest people. If you want to tell who the poorest people in the world are, you look at labour markets, not at other things. However, and that's, to us, we've done wage and labour market research in lots of countries in the developing world, so on and so forth. That wasn't such a big surprise. We know what's wrong with the standard surveys and so on. This came as a bit of a surprise. So on average, we looked at, we were looking at coffee and flowers in Ethiopia and coffee and tea in Uganda. And we found that on average, both the wages and the non-wage working conditions were worse. In our research sites that were defined around the fair trade producer organisation, hello?
Sorry to interrupt. Can I just clarify?
When you say count in my time.
When you say on wage labour, does that mean they don't own the land?
They don't own the land.
That's the separation.
Some of them might be doing both. They might have a little plot of their own land, but they're also working. They're working for wages. It's paid work, definitely, very definitely. You stopped me in my flow. Anyway, this was very, very important. We can talk about it more if you like. The really interesting thing was we tried to, I don't like using the word longitudinal because it was only a year or two later, so it's quite short, but various things happened. We went back, particularly to coffee workers in both countries, and there had been changes, for example, in inflation, in local inflation, and we tried to look at whether, or in the price of coffee internationally, we tried to work out whether this gets through to wage workers. And we found that it didn't. In fact, in some cases it did a tiny bit, but what then you found, if wages increased in some places in Uganda, what happened was the wages in the non-fair trade areas increased by more. Whereas other places where we worked, and particularly in Ethiopia, what we found is that the wages in coffee production, in real terms, they declined. It got worse over time, and more so than in the research sites where there was no fair trade certified producer organisation. Now, this does take time, so I'll just scoot through these. This usually, when you look at official data, surveys, so on and so forth, you find estimates that maybe something like 2 or 3% of people are involved in wage employment in rural Africa. We were finding much, much higher. That's because of the way that surveys are usually questionnaires are designed and so on and so forth. It's very widespread and it's very important. So this is male and female wage employment rates. About half our sample was women, half men. And so, for example, just more detail on what I showed you before. Generally in Ethiopia, in flour and coffee workers were paid they were statistically significantly lower wages. Uganda is a bit more complicated. Tea workers generally, yes, significant, much lower. Coffee workers, it was fairly similar, although there was a bigger gender gap in pay in the fair trade certified areas than in the others. So this shows you, for example, just the same thing in another way. And I won't show you the Uganda one, I've excluded that. On the whole, you'll find that in flowers, wages, just sort of peri-urban, they're a little bit higher than these sort of more remote coffee-producing areas. Now, in the whole kind of ethical consumption and trade literature, there's a thing, when we read our papers and campaigns, so on and so forth, that's focused on very, very often, and it's a price gap. It's telling you a story about how terribly unfair it is, the gap, right, between the price received by a smallholder coffee producer, whatever a smallholder coffee producer is, it's a fairly meaningless term, versus the price received by a UK supermarket. Is that fair? No. But we don't ask a different question, which is about the wage gap. Look how much more unfair that gap looks, to put it in crude terms. So this is a coffee picker and what they earn compared to some guy on the executive of the certified cooperative in rural Uganda, in rural Ethiopia. And then very naughtily, it's quite hard to find out, they're not hugely transparent about their salaries, and maybe that's the reason why. This is a huge problem for people who think they're trying to help poverty reduction amongst the poorest through buying fair trade certified products. And so I don't know about hope. You said we were talking about hope this afternoon for alternatives. I'm not sure how hopeful fair trade is as an alternative. So the question then, in a great rush, becomes, well, can we do the right thing through the way we consume things produced a very, very long way away? And I will rush through these for time constraint reasons. And one is, I think, that there's a duty to have much more accurate information, even about the limits of claims made for fair trade. I know that the effect of research like mine and my colleagues, but also other people doing critical research is, but this, what on earth are we supposed to do? This makes our life harder. It should. It really should. I don't have the perfect answer, but I do think that we need to probe our difficulties, our uncertainty, our lack of knowledge here. DFID, for example, the EU gives Fair Trade International a lot of money. DFID gives it around 12 million quid a year. Are they asking enough of fair trade in terms of the data it collects and whether it really is getting through to the poorest people? Or maybe it shouldn't. Maybe fair trade should just say, look, we can't help the poorest people. That's not what we're about. We're about supporting the emergence of small, medium-scale rural capitalists in Africa or Central America. That might be fine. I don't think it's the most efficient way to do that, but it might be fine. But I don't think they're somehow going to say that. And more broadly, I think, when you look at work on cocoa and so on and so forth, it's really, things like fair trade, labelling, certification are possibly not how you really make big significant changes. But possibly what government policy does may make some difference, although it's very hard. I can talk about the sort of things that might involve. One question we were left hanging with is, because people say, well, look, what does determine? Why are some people in the areas without a fair trade certified producer being treated better? They're being offered more days of labour, they're being paid slightly better, and their non-wage working conditions are often slightly better. What's going on? And there are lots of reasons, some of them to do with size, but often not to do with size. And one question, and it's one I'd like to pursue more in the future, is you can think of an area where one of our research sites, which was poorer, so smallholder farming, roughly speaking, but no fair trade certification, generally poorer, according to a range of indicators, than the smallholder area producing coffee in rural Ethiopia with a fair trade certified producer organisation. But the performance was better. And what seemed to lie behind that, one of the things that lies behind that for us, is a record of about 30 years of a very, very close relationship between I'm not allowed to say who, but a very well-known international coffee company that prides itself on quality, and a large, I think possibly the largest coffee washing station in Africa. And the argument, in a way, would go like this. I'm not wholly attached to it, but the argument would be, if you really want to produce top quality coffee, which actually fetches a much better price than you can get for a lot of fair trade stuff, you have to take great care of your coffee cherries, so on and so forth, and when you pick them, how you pick them, how you look after them afterwards, how you wash them, how you dry them, so on and so forth. And in the process of all of that, you probably have to treat your workers a little bit better if you want them to do a decent job. It's a puzzle, I don't know, and I'm probably out of time, so I'm going to stop there.
Great.
Good.